Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Papers Podcast. Today, we have a methods consult for you. That's when I try to lay bare the methods in our research madness. Today's methods consult is actually a direct reply to a request from one of you, one of our listeners. We got a message from Ayush Gabrani, and today, I'm actually going to offer this episode as a reply to his letter. Ayush wrote, and I quote, I'm a new clinical faculty at the University of Minnesota in pediatrics and recently completed my MHPE from Maastricht. Congratulations, Ayush. Throughout my last 2 years of master's, the Papers Podcast and Keyline before that had helped me a lot, especially your methods consult. I used to listen to the podcast every day while working out in the gym. I got through all 400-something episodes in 2 years because I listened at 1.5 speed, though I know evidence on this is still debatable. It all definitely helped me write my thesis and gave me confidence to defend it last month. On the topic of method consult episodes, one of the most basic and foundational episodes is the one on theory, theoretical frameworks, and conceptual frameworks. Your paper on this was one of the most frequently read papers for me in the last 2 years. Well, I feel like I owe you an apology for that, Ayush. Okay, but I'm going to keep reading. However, despite reading it so many times and listening to the Methods Consult episode, I've always wondered how to depict those ideas in a model. I tried creating 2 models for that, tried to explain it to students and faculty in MHPE class, but no one quite understood or agreed with that diagram. Would you be kind enough to provide your feedback on that? End of quote. Well, Ayush, it took me a few minutes or, let's be honest, years to figure out what I thought the differences were between those concepts too. I took a look at your figure and I think it has some strengths, but I also want to offer or suggest some modifications. So in the show notes for this recording, I'm posting my figure on our website. And in this recording, I'm going to walk through that figure with you. My hope is that I can help to highlight some of the differences that make a difference between those 3 interconnected concepts: conceptual framework, theory, and theoretical framework. So let's begin. To do that, though, I'm going to invite all of you listeners to first pause your recording, head over to the paperspodcast.com and download the figure that I created for our episode, because we're going to walk through it. As you'll see, that figure works from left to right. Now, what that implies is that this is a very linear process. And the first thing I need to do is tell you that it's not. You'll see that the arrows there are moving from conceptual framework through theory to theoretical framework. But the truth of the matter is, and as we'll talk about today, often we find ourselves going back and forth across different pieces because as we do more thinking, we start to change our minds about some of our choices. And that means we have to go backwards and do some revision, rework of our designs. So let's start at the very beginning. And that's with your conceptual framework. So what is a conceptual framework? Well, if we go to the paper, and I do hate to self-cite, but this is a paper entitled The Distinctions Between Theory, Theoretical Framework, and Conceptual Framework. I'm the first author, and I had the great fortune of working with Elise Paradis, Sebastian Uthagen, and Meredith Young to write this paper. You're going to find it in Academic Medicine 2020. Don't worry, I've also dropped a link to that paper in the show notes. So, what is a conceptual framework? Well, the definition of conceptual framework that we created, that we hold on to, is that a conceptual framework is the justification for why a given study should be conducted. The conceptual framework describes the state of known knowledge. Usually that takes the shape of a lit review. It identifies gaps in our understanding, and it outlines some methodological underpinning. So it answers essentially 2 questions. Why is this research important, and what contributions might these findings make to what's already known? Fine. If we go back to our figure then, you'll see that I offer you a couple of questions that you might ask yourself as you build your conceptual framework. And a lot of this you're going to do without explicitly thinking about it. So these are questions like, why do I care about this topic? Why is it important to me? What does the literature say about this topic? What are some related topics? And how are they related to the concept or phenomenon or topic that I want to study? Here's an important one. What purpose do I want to achieve with this research? Because this is partially shaped by what you care about. And it should also be shaped by another question: what can I do in my context? What is feasible? And then last but absolutely not least, because if you've been listening to the podcast, you know how I feel about a paradigm. What paradigm do I align with? So if that's your conceptual framework, you start with that, and that is essentially shaping why you care about this study, what you're going to be thinking about. What are you trying to contribute? Fine. So congratulations, you have built yourself a conceptual framework. You've managed to pull that off. What comes next? Well, now, with all of that thinking behind you, you're going to start writing and drafting your research question. And all conceptual framework considerations have to be shaping that question. The conceptual framework, that work, all those questions that you've answered, that will lead you to believe that this particular research question, the one you're writing right now, will develop novel insights. So that's new knowledge, and it's feasible for you to complete, right? So your research question isn't something you just pulled out of nowhere. Your research question takes all of those conceptual framework considerations and writes a question that's meaningful. All right. So your conceptual framework comes first. It's all of the reasons why we're going to do this, the things you've learned. From that basis, you then develop a research question. So now what? Well, now you have the tricky question of what theory will help me answer this question. Now, here's a really important thing to know. I think it's really important for us to think of theory as a series of different options, or, if you think of them as pairs of glasses that we can put to help our vision. Each theory has a different lens, and those lenses help you to see the phenomenon of study in different ways. So I don't think there's ever a right theory choice. It's not that your theory choice could be wrong necessarily. There are things you should be taking into consideration. Your theory selection should align with your conceptual framework. So for instance, let me give you an example. If you are working with a phenomenon and you believe that it's a psychological phenomenon, that this is something that each individual cares about and thinks about privately within themselves. So for instance, if it's professional identity formation, if you think about professional identity formation at the level of the individual, the theory you choose should be a theory of the individual, probably psychological. But if you believe professional identity to be an individual-focused phenomenon, you don't want to reach out to a theory that is steeped in social ways of thinking. You don't want a social theory because it's not aligned with the way you're thinking of the phenomenon as an individual psychological thing, right? So in picking your theory, it's not that you're not revisiting your conceptual framework. When you pick a theory, you still have to consider your conceptual framework and all of the things that you were thinking about and deciding there, because your theory should align. Another way it should align is paradigmatically. If you're going to work from a post-positivist paradigm, you want a theory that will help you to do that. You don't want a theory that works from an interpretivist way of thinking, right? Perfect. So what theory is going to help you answer your question? You've got all your lenses laid out. You've got all these choices to make, and you're going to make one, remembering that it's not right and it's not wrong. What you're doing is picking a pair of glasses to wear to understand the phenomenon and your study, and that's going to shape the way you design your study. Fine. So now we've picked a theory. What is the definition of a theory? Let's go back to that paper. The definition of a theory is a set of propositions that are logically related, expressing relations among several different constructs or propositions. In other words, a theory is an abstract description of relationships between concepts that help us understand the world. So a theory by definition is abstract. It's an abstract description that helps us understand a phenomenon. So what does that mean? Now, this is really important, right? Why is a theory abstract? Well, we write it in abstract ways so that it helps us understand that phenomenon when we apply it to specific contexts. If a theory is very specific to a local context and just these people here, it's not very transferable or generalizable to other situations. If the phenomenon exists in many situations, you want your theory to speak across that general space, right? Across contexts. So by definition, we write theories in abstract terms. But what does that mean for you when you're building your study? Well, you have a theory that's too abstract to be useful. This means you need to operationalize the theory so that you can use it in the study. You need to take it out of the abstract and fit it into your context, into your study design. You have to shape study design and things like that to account for the way the theory thinks, right? So we had our conceptual framework from which we built a question, we picked a theory, and now this theory is too abstract for us to use. So what am I going to do? You guessed it, you're going to build a theoretical framework. Let's go back to our paper and see what the definition of theoretical framework is. A theoretical framework is, and I quote, a logically developed connected set of concepts and premises developed from one or more theories that a researcher creates to scaffold a study. To create a theoretical framework, the researcher must define any concepts and theories that will provide the grounding of the research, unite them through logical connections, and relate these concepts to the study that is being carried out. In short, a theoretical framework is a reflection of the work the researcher engages in to use a theory in a given study. End of quote. It's only after you write a paper sometimes you realize I probably could have said that more simply. Let's see if I can say that more simply here. Man, I'm having publication regret. I'll get over that. All right, where were we? Theoretical framework. What is a theoretical framework? If I take that definition as a springboard, a theoretical framework is how I am going to use this theory to inform my study. How am I going to use it to shape my study? Now, in the definition, you hear there that you can use more than one theory at the same time. Totally can, but we're only going to talk in this podcast about using one theory at a time because, quite frankly, that's hard enough anyway. I rarely mix theories in my own research because it's tricky. There's lots of considerations. We're not going to get into that. So let me give you an example. Let's say we have a theory about learning, and let's say that that's a theory about collaborative learning in groups. So when learners learn in collaborative contexts with other learners. Fine. Let's say we have this theory. Let's say that one of the premises, one of the foundational statements within the theory states, learners' experiences of collaborative learning should involve small group interactions. Fine. That's a good premise, right? Collaborative learning should involve small group interactions. Well, there's a ton of pieces in there that we need to now put into action in our study. Let's just take one, right? Let's talk about small group, right? So the premise was learners' experiences of collaborative learning should involve small groups. Well, what do we mean by small group? How am I going to bring the concept of small groups to life in my study, in my context? Will it be virtual? Will it be interprofessional, intra-professional, multi-professional? How small is small? Is it less than 5? Is it less than 15? And another piece of that is about collaborative learning in these small groups. Well, how are you going to know that learning is happening as opposed to just a situation where they're all sitting around the same table and working independently of each other, but beside each other? Is that learning? Maybe we're going to say that the co-creation of knowledge is a signal of collaborative learning. All right, well, how are you going to know you're seeing co-creation of knowledge? What is that going to look like? How are you going to prompt it? How are you going to encourage that? This is all part of the theoretical framework that you build to take the theory that you chose and implement it in your study. Once you have your conceptual framework that brings you to a research question, that brings you to a choice of theory, that brings you to your theoretical framework, you're really getting quite deep now into study design. You're going into the process of making decisions and constructing ways of collecting data, of analyzing data, of knowing when the data is speaking to the phenomenon you care about, of thinking about what different pieces of the phenomenon are relatable to each other. you're doing all kinds of design work. So, dear listener, when you are thinking about theoretical frameworks, conceptual frameworks, it's really important to remember that they live together and they inform each other. So I remember we talked about how as you go on, you might go back into the process or go backwards to the left-hand side of the diagram. Well, maybe as you're working through building your theoretical framework, you realize that you had been thinking about the phenomenon in a different way. Maybe you go back to your conceptual framework and realize actually your paradigm may not fit with the way you want to study this phenomenon. And so now you have to revise your conceptual framework, which will probably change your research question, which may or may not change your theory, choice, and theoretical framework, right? So these elements go back and forth. They shape the design of your study, and they'll shape the study as it rolls out. So my hope right now is that this helps us to understand the difference between conceptual framework, theory, and theoretical framework. Again, on the website, you will have a link to the figure that I just created for this podcast and also the original manuscript that we wrote when we tried to figure out these differences. You know, doing these methods consults is always a real challenge for me because sometimes I don't know the questions that listeners would care about. Sometimes the things that I think are hard aren't necessarily the things others think are hard. And to be honest, it's also a little bit challenging to do these by myself because I enjoy the interactions with the team. But listeners, I do think about these consults as you and I interacting. So please feel free to write to us. Listeners, there's a lot of people listening who have questions about specific topics in our field, about methods-related concepts, or about life as a clinician educator. And I'm of the opinion that if you're having a question, chances are many a listener is also having the same quandary, is also having the same question. So please write to us. Write to us with your questions and we'll reply. Maybe even like today, we'll reply with an episode dedicated to answering your letter. And so to Ayush, thank you for listening to the podcast. And thank you for caring so much about doing rigorous research. It is thanks to the care and attention of researchers like you that we can trust our knowledge base to be a strong foundation for evidence-informed and evidence-guided educational processes and programs. So Ayush, and to all of you who continue to wrestle with hard questions, thank you. Thank you for that. The data and knowledge and evidence that you build is something we all rely on. And I, anyway, really appreciate the time, attention, care, and rigor that you bring to that thinking. And so, listeners, that's the end of another Methods Consult. Let me know if it resonates for you. Ayush, let me know if my figure doesn't work for you. Maybe we can do some back and forth. But until next time, y'all, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope this Methods Consult is of some use to you. And until we hear from you next time, I'll say, talk to you later.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.